They say the worst prisons are the ones we build ourselves. Mine had walls made of concealer and excuses, bars forged from shame, and the desperate hope that tomorrow he'd be different. I'd perfected the art of invisibility, arriving early, leaving late, speaking only when spoken to. But you can't hide blood under fluorescent lights forever. The night everything changed, I was alone in an elevator, watching myself dissolve in the mirrored walls when my boss stepped inside. Adrian Morello, the man whose empire touched everything from Wall Street to the city's darkest corners. He looked at me the way surgeons examine wounds, clinically, completely. And in his silence, I heard a promise that terrified me more than Evan's rage. You're mine to protect now. Before we begin, click subscribe, like this video. And tell me in the comment section where you are watching from. Your support helps us bring more thrilling stories. And trust me, you won't want to miss them. Now, let's get into the story. The ache had become a language I understood better than words. It lived in my ribs where Evan's boot had connected 2 nights ago, in the tender purple bloom along my jawline that no amount of concealer could fully erase, in the constant metallic taste where I'd bitten my tongue to keep from screaming. Pain had become my closest companion, more constant than hope, more reliable than love. Morello International Holdings occupied the top 15 floors of the Meridian Tower, a gleaming monument to power that pierced the Manhattan skyline like a steel promise. From the ground, the building looked beautiful, all silver and glass, reflecting clouds and ambition in equal measure. But beauty, I'd learned, was often just another kind of cage. The fluorescent lights of the 23rd floor cast everything in stark relief: polished marble, chrome fixtures, the endless expanse of glass walls that made privacy an illusion. I'd chosen this job 8 months ago because of its invisibility. Executive assistants were furniture, seen but not noticed, necessary but unremarkable. I could blend into the beige walls and expensive artwork, become a ghost haunting the corridors of corporate power. Tonight, I'd stayed late deliberately. Evan didn't like it when I worked past 6, accused me of wanting attention from other men, of trying to escape him. The irony burned like acid. I'd become an expert at making myself small, at moving through the world like smoke, present but substance-less. Yet somehow it was never enough. My fingers trembled as I gathered scattered papers, each breath a small agony where my ribs protested. The office was tomb quiet at 8:47 p.m., just the hum of computers and the distant whoosh of the HVAC system. I preferred it this way, alone, invisible, safe from questions I couldn't answer and concern I didn't deserve. The elevator dinged softly in the empty corridor, startling me despite the silence. I wasn't expecting anyone. Mr. Morello had left hours ago for a dinner meeting downtown, his schedule as precise as everything else about him. In 8 months as his executive assistant, I'd learned to read his moods by the weight of his footsteps, the set of his shoulders, the particular shade of darkness in his eyes when business turned complicated. I gathered my purse and coat, ignoring the way my hands shook, the way my vision blurred at the edges from exhaustion and pain. Just get home, lock the door, survive another night. The mantra had become my liturgy, prayers whispered to a God who'd stopped listening long ago. The elevator arrived empty, chrome doors sliding open to reveal mirrored walls that turned my reflection infinite, 1,000 broken versions of Clara Vance, each one more fractured than the last. I stepped inside, pressed the lobby button, and waited for the doors to close on another day survived. But they didn't close. The mascara started running before I could stop it. I'd held everything together through 8 hours of phone calls and filing, through the constant ache in my ribs and the pounding headache that had taken root behind my eyes. I'd smiled at delivery people and nodded at colleagues, played the part of competent, composed Clara Vance with the dedication of an actress who knows one missed cue means the end of everything. But elevators, I'd discovered, were truth chambers, sealed boxes where performance became impossible. The tears came hot and fast, spilling over the dam I'd built from pride and terror. My reflections swam in the polished chrome, a watercolor painting of grief melting down my face. I pressed the lobby button again, harder, as if urgency could make the doors understand. Close, please, before someone sees. The doors began their slow glide toward Mercy. Then a hand, broad, male, wearing a watch that cost more than my yearly salary, appeared in the gap, stopping them cold. My heart seized. Every muscle in my battered body locked tight with the familiar spike of adrenaline that meant danger, run, hide. But there was nowhere to go in 4 feet of mirrored steel. Adrian Morello stepped inside. He wore his authority like other men wore cologne, understated but undeniable, filling the space until the elevator felt impossibly small. His suit was midnight blue, tailored to emphasize the lean strength beneath, and his shoes, handmade Italian leather, made no sound against the elevator floor. But it was his eyes that pinned me in place, dark, intelligent, and in this moment, entirely focused on my face. I turned away quickly, swiping at my cheeks with trembling fingers, trying to salvage something from the wreckage of my composure. "Mr. Morello, I'm sorry, I thought everyone had left. I was just—" "Look at me." 2 words, spoken quietly, but carrying the weight of absolute command. The kind of voice that had built empires and broken men, that negotiated billion-dollar deals and, if the whispers in the break room held truth, settled disputes in ways that never made the morning news. I wouldn't. If he saw me clearly, truly saw what I'd become, there would be questions. Questions led to explanations. Explanations required lies I was too tired to construct. "Miss Vance," his voice dropped lower, and somehow that made it more compelling. "Clara, look at me." The use of my first name cracked something inside my chest. In 8 months, he'd never called me anything but Miss Vance, maintaining the professional distance that made working for him possible. But now, in this confined space that smelled like his cologne and my fear, formality felt like another wall crumbling. I raised my eyes to his reflection in the mirrored wall, safer than meeting his gaze directly, but still exposing enough. His expression didn't change. No shock, no pity, no disgust. Just a terrible stillness that was somehow more frightening than reaction. He studied my face the way art collectors examined paintings, cataloging every detail. The smudged mascara tracking down my cheeks, the slight swelling at the corner of my mouth, the greenish-yellow bruise at my temple that makeup had almost hidden. Almost. The elevator remained stopped. Doors open to the empty 23rd floor. Neither of us moved. "Rough night?" he finally asked, his tone carefully neutral. The question was so absurd, so monumentally inadequate to describe the reality of my existence, that I almost laughed. Instead, something between a sob and a gasp escaped my throat. I pressed my hand against my ribs, where pain flared with the involuntary movement. His eyes tracked the gesture with predatory precision. "I'm fine," I managed, the lie as automatic as breathing. "Just clumsy. I fell earlier and—" "Don't!" 1 word, but it sliced through my explanation like a blade through silk. "Don't insult my intelligence with lies, Clara." He stepped fully into the elevator now, letting the doors close behind him, sealing us together in chrome and glass and terrible understanding. "And don't insult yourself by pretending you deserve this." The elevator began its descent, but I barely noticed. All my attention had narrowed to the man standing 2 feet away, radiating a controlled fury that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with what he saw written on my skin. "It's not your concern," I whispered, wrapping my arms around myself, a futile attempt at protection that fooled neither of us. "You're wrong." He moved closer, and I flinched instinctively, not from fear of him, but from the muscle memory that equated male proximity with pain. He stopped immediately, jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said quietly, and something in his voice made me believe him. "But I need you to tell me who did." The elevator passed the 15th floor, 14th, 13th. Each descending number felt like a countdown to something irreversible. "I can't." My voice broke on the words. "You don't understand. If I tell anyone, if I try to leave, he'll what?" Adrian's voice went cold, deadly. "Kill you? Make it worse?" His eyes bore into mine through the mirror. "Let me tell you what happens now, Clara. You're going to give me his name. Then you're going to go home, not to him, but to the Meridian Hotel across the street. I'll have a suite arranged within the hour, and you're going to let me handle this." "Handle this?" Horror bloomed in my chest. "No, you can't. I don't need you to." "His name, Clara. 10th floor, 9th, 8th. I saw my reflection fracture into 1,000 pieces, each one showing a different version of what happened next. In some, I stayed silent. In others, I ran. But in all of them, I was tired. So desperately tired of carrying this alone. "Evan Caro," I whispered, and the name tasted like ashes. "His name is Evan Caro." Something flickered in Adrian's eyes. Recognition? Calculation? And was gone so quickly I might have imagined it. But his next words confirmed I hadn't. "Caro. Works in pharmaceutical distribution, correct? Lives in Astoria, drives a black Audi?" Ice flooded my veins. "How do you know that?" His smile was brief and held no warmth. "I know everyone who matters in this city, Clara, and anyone who touches what's mine matters very much indeed." What's mine? The words hung between us like a promise and a threat. The elevator reached the lobby with a soft ding. The door slid open to reveal marble floors and the night security guard dozing at his desk. The real world waited beyond: cold autumn air, traffic sounds, the possibility of escape or the certainty of return. I started to step forward, but Adrian's voice stopped me. "Miss Vance!" I looked back. He stood in the elevator threshold, backlit by fluorescent light, and in his perfect stillness I saw the truth of what everyone whispered about Adrian Morello, that beneath the polish and propriety lived something ancient and unforgiving. "Go to the Meridian. Ask for suite 22847. It's under your name." He pressed something into my hand, a hotel key card that shouldn't have existed yet. "And Clara? Don't go home tonight. Don't call him. Don't warn him." His eyes met mine, dark as midnight and twice as final. "In fact, don't think about him at all. By morning, Evan Caro won't be your problem anymore." The doors began to close between us. "What are you going to do?" I asked, though part of me already knew. His last words followed me into the lobby like smoke. "What should have been done the moment he first touched you?" The night air hit my face like a slap of clarity as I stumbled out of the Meridian Tower. Traffic rushed past on Park Avenue, yellow cabs and town cars ferrying people to lives that made sense. My hand clenched around the key card until its edges bit into my palm. Suite 2847, a refuge I hadn't asked for, offered by a man I barely knew. "By morning, Evan Caro won't be your problem anymore. I should call the police, should warn Evan whatever he'd done to me, should do anything except walk across the street to a hotel room purchased by my boss's command and wait for dawn to reveal what Adrian Morello meant by 'handle this.' But as I stood there, autumn wind cutting through my thin coat, feeling the ache in my ribs and tasting blood where I'd bitten my tongue, I realized something terrifying. I didn't want to stop him. Whatever Adrian was planning, whatever darkness lived behind his tailored suits and careful courtesy, part of me wanted Evan to face it, wanted someone, finally, to say no more in a language violence understood. The Meridian Hotel rose before me, all glass and light and the promise of one night without fear. I crossed the street. Behind me, the Morello International Building stood sentinel against the sky, its lights burning like watchful eyes. And somewhere in that tower, Adrian Morello was making phone calls that would end a life I'd been too broken to escape. The keycard felt heavy in my hand as I entered the lobby, heavy with choice, with consequence, with the weight of a decision I couldn't unmake. What have I done? But deeper, more honest. Thank God someone finally did something. 6 months earlier, before elevator confessions and hotel room sanctuaries, before I knew that salvation could wear an expensive suit and carry the scent of danger, I'd believed in fairness, in justice, in the fantasy that if you just worked hard enough, stayed quiet enough, made yourself small enough, the world would leave you alone. I'd believed that love could be gentle. I'd been wrong about everything. The hotel sheets were too soft, the silence too complete. I woke at 5:47 a.m. in suite 2847, disoriented by the absence of fear. No footsteps in the hallway, no fumbling at the lock, no bracing for whatever mood Evan would bring through the door. Just Egyptian cotton and the muted hum of a city 23 floors below, indifferent to the small catastrophe of my life. The bruise on my ribs had deepened overnight to a wine-dark purple. I traced its edges in the bathroom mirror, cataloging damage the way Adrian had cataloged my face. Clinically, completely. Evidence of what I'd escaped, or what I'd unleashed. By morning, Evan Caro won't be your problem anymore. My phone sat on the marble counter, screen dark, 17 missed calls from a number I'd deleted but still recognized. Each one a question mark, each silence between them more terrifying than the last. I didn't call back. At 7:15, I stepped out of the Meridian in yesterday's clothes and yesterday's fear, crossing Park Avenue toward the Morello International Building. The morning commute swallowed me, anonymous among thousands of people carrying briefcases and coffee, performing the ritual of productivity. No one looked at me twice. No one saw the fault lines running through my carefully constructed composure. The way my hands shook as I swiped my security card, the fact that I'd slept in a hotel room arranged by a man who'd promised to make my boyfriend disappear. The elevator arrived empty. I stepped inside, and the mirrored walls threw my reflection back infinitely, 1,000 Claras, each one wondering what happened after those doors closed last night, after Adrian's dark promise followed me into the lobby, 23rd floor. The doors opened onto familiar territory made strange by knowledge. This was the last place I'd told the truth, the last place I'd spoken Evan's name aloud before Adrian Morello decided it would be erased. The office looked exactly as I'd left it, papers still scattered on my desk, cold coffee in a forgotten mug, the overnight security log showing nothing unusual, as if violence and vengeance couldn't touch places that smelled like expensive coffee and ambition. I powered on my computer, fingers moving through the morning routine with mechanical precision. Emails. Calendar. The 9:30 with the Carol group that had been rescheduled. Everything normal. Everything wrong. Miss Vance. His voice reached me before I saw him. Low, measured, carrying none of last night's fury. I looked up to find Adrian standing in his office doorway, tailored charcoal suit pristine, watch catching the overhead lights, every inch the composed executive who'd built an empire on control and precision. Only his eyes betrayed him. They found mine across the chrome and glass, and in them I saw recognition, not of an employee, but of a secret shared, a line crossed. "Good morning, Mr. Morello." My voice came steadier than expected. "Your 8 track with the Tokyo investors has been moved to 8:30. The quarterly projections are on your desk and— Come inside, please." Not a request. I rose on unsteady legs, crossing the threshold into his office, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan, minimalist furniture that cost more than most apartments, and the faint scent of his cologne, mixing with leather and something darker I couldn't name. Power, maybe, or consequence. He closed the door with a soft click. The glass walls remained transparent, but somehow the world beyond them felt distant, irrelevant. "Did you sleep?" he asked. The question was so unexpected, so completely unrelated to quarterly reports and investor meetings, that I almost laughed. "Yes." "Good." He moved behind his desk, pressed a button on his phone. "Marco, come up, now." Then his attention returned to me. "No one will ask you about last night. No one will mention his name in your presence. If anyone contacts you, police, reporters, concerned friends, you refer them directly to me. Understood?" Police, reporters. The implications hit like ice water. "What did you do?" I whispered. His expression remained implacable. I removed a problem. Before I could respond, a knock sounded. The door opened to reveal a man who looked like violence, wearing an expensive suit, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had seen too much and forgotten nothing. Marco Vieri, head of security. I'd seen him in the building before, trailing Adrian like a well-dressed shadow, but we'd never spoken. His eyes passed over me once, cataloging, dismissing, before focusing entirely on Adrian. "The shipment from Rotterdam is missing," Marco said without preamble, his voice carrying the faint rasp of cigarettes and secrets. 12 containers worth approximately $4.2 million. Harbor Master says the manifests were altered. Professional work. Adrian's jaw tightened fractionally. Names. Marco consulted a tablet, scrolling through information I shouldn't be hearing. The usual suspects, Dimitri's crew out of Brighton Beach, the Valenti cousins, and... He paused, something shifting in his expression. Evan Caro was listed as a secondary distributor on 3 of the containers. Pharmaceuticals. The name hung in the air like smoke. I watched Adrian's face carefully, looking for recognition, for guilt, for any sign that Evan's connection to his business empire mattered. But he revealed nothing. Just nodded once, curt and controlled. "Remove him from all records," Adrian said quietly. "Effective immediately. Reassign his distributions to Torres." "Already done," Marco replied. His eyes flickered to me again, and this time I saw understanding. He knew. Somehow, he knew exactly why Evan Caro was being erased from every database, every contract, every trace of Morello International business. "Anything else?" Adrian asked. "No police reports filed, no hospital admissions, no complications." Marco's words were careful, coded, final. The room seemed to tilt slightly. No police reports, no hospital admissions. Which meant wherever Evan had gone, whatever Adrian had arranged, it had been clean, quiet, complete. "Thank you, Marco." Dismissal. The security chief nodded once to Adrian, didn't acknowledge me at all, and left as silently as he'd arrived. Silence settled between us, heavy with unspoken truths. "You should go home today," Adrian said finally. "Collect your things. I'll have movers handle the heavy items. I have a lease. Terminated. You'll receive the security deposit plus 6 months compensation." He picked up a folder, flipped it open with clinical efficiency. "The suite at the Meridian is yours for the next month, while you look for something more permanent. Or," his eyes met mine, dark and entirely serious, "you can remain there indefinitely, under my protection." Protection. The word felt loaded, dangerous. "I don't understand what's happening," I said, voice barely above a whisper. "Yesterday, I was just your assistant. Today, you're arranging my entire life, and Evan is—" I couldn't finish the sentence. "Yesterday," Adrian corrected quietly, "you were a woman being slowly destroyed by a man who believed violence was love. Today, you're free. The method is irrelevant." "The method is murder." I said it, finally. The word we'd been dancing around since the elevator, since his promise, since Marco's careful report of no complications. Adrian didn't flinch. "Murder requires a body, requires evidence, requires questions that won't be asked because Evan Caro was nobody important to anyone who matters." He leaned forward slightly, and I saw the truth of him, the thing that lived beneath tailored suits and quarterly projections. "But you matter, Clara. You matter to me. And what matters to me stays safe." The city sprawled beyond his windows, millions of lives, millions of secrets, and somewhere in that vast indifference, Evan Caro had ceased to exist. I should feel horror, should call the police, should run, should do anything except stand here accepting salvation from a man who'd just confessed to making someone disappear. Instead, I felt the weight of 17 missed calls on my phone, felt the ache in my ribs beginning to fade, felt, for the first time in months, like I could breathe without calculating the cost. "I need to work," I said finally. "The Carol meeting is handled. Adrian's voice gentled fractionally. "Take the day. Adjust. Tomorrow, everything returns to normal." Normal, as if normal existed anymore. I turned toward the door, hand on the chrome handle, when his voice stopped me one final time. "Clara, you're safe now, whether you believe it or not." The elevator arrived empty. Again. I stepped inside, watched my reflection multiply infinitely in chrome walls that had witnessed my breaking, my confession, my transformation into someone who accepted darkness as deliverance. This time, my eyes weren't red. The mascara sat perfect. The foundation held. But as the elevator descended through floors 23, 22, 21, I felt it. The weight of observation, of protection wrapped in surveillance. Adrian Morello had promised I mattered. What he hadn't said was that things that mattered to him never left his sight. The doors opened to the lobby. And I stepped into morning light, wondering if I'd escaped one cage only to enter another. This one lined with silk and violence and a man whose devotion might be more dangerous than Evan's rage had ever been. My phone buzzed. One new message, number unknown. "Sleep well tonight. You've earned it." No signature, none needed. I deleted it, crossed the lobby, and walked into a world that looked exactly the same, but felt fundamentally altered. Protected, hunted, claimed. I couldn't decide which. Maybe all three. The detective arrived at 2:17 p.m., announced by the receptionist's nervous voice over the intercom. "Miss Vance, there's a Detective Rivas here to see Mr. Morello." I looked up from the expense reports I'd been pretending to review, my heart immediately kicking into overdrive. "Detective." The word felt like a hand closing around my throat. Through the glass walls, I watched Adrian's silhouette shift in his office, a slight turn of his head, nothing more. But I'd learned to read his stillness the way meteorologists read gathering storms. "Send him up," I said, voice steadier than my hands. Detective Lucien Rivas emerged from the elevator 90 seconds later, wearing a worn trench coat that had seen too many crime scenes and eyes that had cataloged too many lies. He was mid-40s, with the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd stopped being surprised by human cruelty sometime around his 10th year on the force. Rain clung to his shoulders, the afternoon storm I'd watched building over Manhattan finally breaking. He carried the scent of wet wool and suspicion. "Detective Rivas, NYPD." He flashed a badge. Perfunctory. "I'm looking for Adrian Morello. Do you have an appointment?" Professional courtesy wrapped around panic. My training held. Smile, screen, protect the schedule. Protect the man who'd promised to make my nightmares disappear. No appointment, just questions. His eyes swept the office. Chrome, marble, glass walls that promised transparency while hiding everything. Then his gaze settled on me, and I felt catalogued, assessed. "You're his assistant?" "Executive assistant, Clara Vance." Something flickered across his expression. Recognition? But of what? "Ms. Vance, how long have you worked here?" 8 months. Each word felt like walking a tightrope. "Is there something I can help you with, Detective?" Before he could answer, Adrian's office door opened. He filled the threshold with the kind of presence that made expensive real estate feel small: tailored navy suit, silver cufflinks catching fluorescent light, expression arranged into polite curiosity that revealed absolutely nothing. "Detective." Adrian extended his hand, and Rivas shook it with the wariness of a man who knew exactly what kind of empire stood before him. "Adrian Morello, I understand you have questions?" "A few. Is there somewhere we can speak privately?" Adrian gestured toward his office. "Of course. Miss Vance, hold my calls." The door closed behind them with a soft click, and suddenly the transparent walls felt like barriers I couldn't penetrate. I watched them through glass, Rivas settling into the chair opposite Adrian's desk, pulling out a worn notebook, his mouth forming words I couldn't hear. My hands trembled as I returned to my computer screen. Just another meeting, just another visitor, nothing unusual. but my heart hammered against my ribs, the same ribs Evan had bruised 3 nights ago, before Adrian Morello decided that violence deserved answering. Through the glass, I saw Rivas slide a photograph across Adrian's desk, too far away to see details, but close enough to watch Adrian's face remain perfectly composed, a mask of polite cooperation that revealed nothing, admitted nothing, feared nothing. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. I counted each one. When Rivas finally emerged, his expression carried the frustration of a man who'd tried to read a book written in invisible ink. His eyes found mine again, lingering a moment too long. "Ms. Vance, do you know a man named Evan Caro?" The name hit like a physical blow. My coffee mug nearly slipped from suddenly nerveless fingers. Why are you asking?" "So you do know him?" Not a question, an observation. Behind him, Adrian appeared in his doorway, silent and watchful. "He's—" My voice caught. "We dated briefly. Months ago. Why? Is he in some kind of trouble?" Rivas studied my face with the intensity of someone trained to spot lies in the microscopic flutter of eyelids, the slight compression of lips. "When's the last time you saw him?" 3 nights ago, when his fist connected with my ribs, when his ring split my lip, when I finally understood that love and violence had become indistinguishable in his mind. 2 weeks ago, I lied. We had coffee, ended things amicably. Amicably. He repeated the word like it tasted false. "And you haven't heard from him since?" The 17 missed calls burned in my phone's memory. I shook my head. "Mr. Caro's employer reported him missing this morning. Hasn't shown up for work in 3 days, phone disconnected, apartment appears abandoned." Rivas pulled out a card, placed it on my desk with deliberate precision. "If he contacts you, I'd appreciate a call." "Of course, Detective." He nodded once, then turned to Adrian. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Morello. I'm sure we'll speak again." "I'm always available to assist law enforcement," Adrian replied smoothly. "Miss Vance will show you out." I watched Rivas disappear into the elevator, his trench coat trailing water across pristine marble, taking with him questions I couldn't answer and suspicions I couldn't deny. The moment the doors closed, Adrian's voice cut through the silence. "Clara, my office, now!" "He knows nothing," Adrian said before I could speak. He stood at the window, hands in pockets, watching rain streak glass. "Evan Caro is one missing person among hundreds in this city every month. Most resurface. Some don't. Unless evidence suggests foul play, the police will file a report and move on. What if they find evidence? They won't." He turned, and his certainty was absolute. "You need to go home. Collect your belongings. I'll have Marco escort you." "I don't need—" "Yes," he interrupted quietly. "You do. Because right now Detective Rivas is running your name through databases. And when he discovers you filed a domestic disturbance report 7 months ago, one that mysteriously disappeared from the system, he's going to become very interested in the timing of Evan's disappearance." The floor seemed to tilt. "How do you know about that report?" His smile was brief, humorless. "I know everything that happens in my orbit, Clara. The question is, are you ready for what comes next?" My apartment door hung slightly ajar when I arrived at 6:30 p.m., Marco's silent presence at my shoulder like a well-dressed shadow. "Stay here," he ordered, producing a gun I hadn't known he carried. But even before he pushed the door fully open, I knew. The silence had a quality, not emptiness, but absence. The difference between a room waiting to be filled and a room that had been deliberately emptied. Every trace of Evan Caro was gone. His leather jacket no longer hung by the door, his boots weren't scattered in the entryway, the cheap cologne that usually permeated the bathroom had vanished, leaving only the faint scent of industrial cleaner and something underneath I didn't want to identify. In the kitchen, his half-empty whiskey bottle sat alone on the counter, the only remaining evidence he'd ever existed here. Beside it, his phone lay shattered, screen splintered into a spider web of cracks. My own phone buzzed. One new message, number unknown. "You're free." 2 words that should have brought relief. Instead, they brought a strange cocktail of emotions I couldn't parse. Gratitude bleeding into guilt, safety wrapped in dread, and underneath it all, a dawning understanding of what Adrian Morello's protection actually meant. Marco holstered his gun with practiced efficiency. "I'll wait outside while you pack." But I barely heard him. I stood in the kitchen that Evan and I had shared, staring at the evidence of his erasure, systematic, complete, terrifying in its precision. "You're free." The message glowed on my screen like both benediction and threat. Across town, 11:47 p.m. The bridge stretched across black water, sodium lights casting everything in sickly yellow, the color of old bruises, of things best left unexamined. Rain had stopped, leaving the city washed clean and lying about its nature. Adrian Morello stood at the railing, expensive suit somehow untouched by the evening's grime, watching the East River carry secrets toward the ocean. Marco stood beside him, silent until silence became its own language. "It's done," Marco said finally. "Clean, complete, no complications." Adrian didn't reply immediately. He watched water move with the patient inevitability of things that couldn't be stopped, only redirected. Somewhere beneath that dark surface, the city kept its secrets, added new ones, forgot the ones that didn't matter. "The detective?" Adrian asked. "Fishing. Nothing concrete. He'll follow procedure, file reports, move on to cases that might actually close." Marco lit a cigarette, the ember briefly illuminating his weathered face. Caro had no family, few friends, and the kind of enemies that make disappearances unsurprising. 6 months he's a statistic, a year he's forgotten. Adrian nodded once, still watching the water. "You know this complicates things," Marco continued carefully. "She's not just an employee anymore. The moment you made this decision, she was never just an employee." Adrian's voice carried absolute certainty. "The moment I saw what he'd done to her, she became something else entirely." "And what's that?" For a long moment, only the sound of water against concrete answered. Then Adrian spoke, quiet as a prayer or a threat. "Mine." He turned from the railing, from the river that kept its secrets, from the city that made monsters, and called them protectors. "No one hurts what's mine," he said to the darkness, to Marco, to whatever god listened to men who'd made peace with damnation. "Not twice." They walked back to the waiting car, leaving the bridge to its sodium-lit solitude. Behind them, the river flowed on, indifferent, eternal, carrying everything toward the ocean where all evidence eventually dissolved. By morning, Evan Caro would be nothing but questions without answers, and Clara Vance would wake in a hotel suite bought with blood money, trying to reconcile safety with the cost of salvation. Monday morning arrived wrapped in the kind of false normalcy that made everything feel like a fever dream. I dressed in the Meridian suite at 6:30 a.m., navy sheath dress, practical heels, the armor of professionalism I'd worn for 8 months. But my hands shook as I applied foundation over bruises that were finally beginning to fade, yellow-green now instead of purple-black. Evidence disappearing the same way Evan had, gradually, thoroughly, leaving only the ghost of what had been. The office felt different when I arrived at 7:45, or maybe I was different. Maybe witnessing your boss order someone's erasure fundamentally altered how fluorescent lights hit marble, how chrome reflected morning sun, how silence between keystrokes felt heavy with unspoken truth. At 8:57, Adrian's door opened. He appeared in the threshold wearing charcoal gray, the color of smoke, of things that dissolved before they could be fully seen, and his expression carried that particular quality of controlled intensity I'd learned meant a decision had already been made. "Miss Vance, my office, please." 4 words that felt like a summons to judgment. I rose on legs that remembered trembling, crossed the space between my desk and his door, stepped into the domain of a man who'd promised protection, and delivered it through methods I couldn't quite bring myself to examine too closely. He closed the door with deliberate care. Through the glass walls, the office beyond remained visible, transparent yet somehow distant, as if we existed in a separate dimension where normal rules had been suspended. "Sit." I sat. He remained standing, positioned at the window with Manhattan sprawling behind him. A king surveying his kingdom, except his kingdom included pharmaceutical distribution networks and men who made problems disappear under bridges washed in sodium light. "We need to discuss your living situation," he began, voice measured in that way that suggested the discussion was really an announcement. "Your lease at the Astoria apartment has been terminated effective immediately. The landlord received 6 months' payment in lieu of notice. He was cooperative." The floor seemed to shift beneath my chair. "You can't just—" "I can." He turned from the window, and his eyes carried that darkness I'd first witnessed in the elevator, the part of him that existed beyond quarterly reports and investor meetings. "Your personal belongings are being moved to the Meridian as we speak. Suite 2847 is yours for the foreseeable future." "The foreseeable future?" My voice came out strangled. "Adrian, you can't just rearrange my entire life without what? Asking permission?" Something almost like amusement flickered across his features. "Clara, 3 days ago, a man disappeared because he put his hands on you. Do you honestly believe I'm going to leave you exposed in an apartment with inadequate security while Detective Rivas asks questions?" The bluntness of it, the casual acknowledgement of what we'd been dancing around, stole my breath. "I can take care of myself," I managed weakly. "Can you?" He moved closer, not threatening but inexorable, until only his desk separated us. "Could you take care of yourself when Evan left bruises that made breathing painful, when he split your lip, when he convinced you that love looked like violence and silence looked like survival?" Each question landed like a physical blow, true and terrible. "That's not fair." "Fair?" Now his voice did sharpen, controlled fury bleeding through the professional veneer. "What's fair is you walking into this building every day pretending your ribs aren't fractured. What's fair is a man who believed he owned you because you were too afraid to leave. What's fair—" He stopped himself, jaw tightening, something dangerous flashing in his eyes before discipline reasserted itself. Silence settled between us, heavy with everything unsaid. When he spoke again, his voice had returned to that terrible calm. "You need protection, Clara, whether you want to admit it or not." "Protection from what?" I stood, needing the illusion of equal footing, even though we both knew the power dynamic had shifted irrevocably. "Evan's gone. You made sure of that. What exactly am I being protected from now?" He studied me for a long moment, and I saw something shift in his expression. Calculation giving way to something more honest, more dangerous. "From the world that let him touch you," he said quietly. "From whoever might ask why your boyfriend disappeared 3 days after his employer's assistant filed a domestic violence report that mysteriously vanished from police records. From Detective Rivas, who's currently running financial analysis on every account connected to Evan Caro's name, and from yourself, because guilt is already eating at you, isn't it? Wondering if you're complicit in murder for speaking his name in an elevator." The accuracy of it, the way he'd catalogued my internal devastation with the same precision he'd catalogued my bruises, made my throat tighten. "I didn't ask you to kill him," I whispered. "No. You asked me who did this to you, and I answered the question you were really asking. Will someone finally make it stop?" He moved around the desk now, closing the distance between us until I could smell his cologne, sandalwood, and something darker, more primal. "This isn't charity, Clara. It's containment." The word hung in the air like a threat wearing the mask of protection. "Containment," I repeated, tasting the implications. "You mean control?" "I mean safety." His eyes held mine, unflinching. "You'll have security. Marco will assign a detail. A driver will take you anywhere you need to go. The suite has everything you require, and if it doesn't, you tell me. No expense reports, no questions, no obligations beyond showing up here and doing your job. And if I refuse?" Even as I asked, I knew the answer. His smile was brief, devoid of humor. "You won't. You're very sure of yourself. I'm sure of you." He reached past me, pulled a folder from his desk, placed it in my trembling hands. "Bank statements." Evan Caro's accounts emptied 3 days ago. Wire transfers to offshore holdings I guarantee Detective Rivas won't trace. As far as the world is concerned, he liquidated assets and ran, gambling debts maybe, or drug problems. The kind of exit that doesn't warrant extensive investigation. I stared at the papers, numbers, value, account codes, the bureaucratic language of erasure. Why are you showing me this? Because I want you to understand what protection looks like. His voice dropped lower, intimate and terrible. I've built an empire on understanding leverage, Clara, and right now the only leverage that matters is keeping you safe from the consequences of what I did for you. What I did for you. Not what you made me do, not what we did together. The responsibility rested entirely on his shoulders, and somehow that made it worse. This man who barely knew me, reshaping reality because I'd cried in an elevator and spoken a name that signed a death warrant. This isn't normal, I said, because someone needed to say it. No. He stepped back, gave me space that felt more like courtesy than concession. But normal stopped existing the moment you lifted your shirt and showed me what he'd done. Normal ended when I decided that some violence deserves answering. Outside the glass walls, phones rang. Colleagues passed with coffee cups and casual conversations. The mundane machinery of corporate life continued, oblivious to the fact that in this office, behind transparent walls, salvation and imprisonment had become indistinguishable. I should say no, I whispered, more to myself than to him. But you won't. Not arrogance, just recognition. Because despite everything, you feel safer in a cage I built than in the freedom that let him hurt you. The truth of it settled in my chest like stone. The Meridian, I said finally, surrendering without quite admitting defeat. Suite 2847. Your things will be there by noon. Marco will escort you after work. Adrian returned to his desk, the conversation apparently concluded. But as I reached for the door, his voice stopped me one final time. Clara, this isn't charity, but it's not prison either. It's simply what happens when something valuable requires protection. Something valuable, not someone, something. The distinction felt important, though I couldn't articulate why. I nodded, acknowledgement without agreement, and left his office, closing the door on a conversation that felt like contract negotiation for my own life. At my desk, I pulled up the calendar for the week. Meetings, calls, the ordinary architecture of corporate productivity. As if I hadn't just agreed to let a man who'd killed for me dictate where I lived, who drove me, how my safety would be maintained. My phone buzzed. Marco Vieri, black sedan, 6 p.m. Don't be late. Not a request, an order. I typed a response, understood, and returned to expense reports, to emails, to the performance of normalcy that had become my specialty. Outside Adrian's office, through glass walls that promised transparency while hiding everything, I caught his reflection watching me, protected, contained, claimed. I still couldn't decide if I'd been saved or captured. Maybe, in Adrian Morello's world, they were the same thing. The suite at the Meridian was a monument to careful opulence, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, furniture that whispered money without shouting it, marble surfaces that reflected a version of myself I barely recognized. My belongings had been arranged with surgical precision, clothes hung in the walk-in closet organized by color, toiletries lined up in the bathroom like soldiers at attention, even my books shelved alphabetically on custom built-ins I hadn't requested. Evidence of invasion disguised as care. I stood at the window as twilight bled across Manhattan, watching lights flicker on in 1,000 anonymous windows. People living ordinary lives where protection didn't require disappearances and safety didn't taste like complicity. The keycard clicked behind me at 8:47 p.m. I didn't turn. Didn't need to. I'd learned to recognize his presence the way prey recognizes predators. Some instinct that operated below conscious thought, reading the displacement of air, the particular quality of silence that preceded him. You shouldn't be here, I said to my reflection in the darkening glass. I own the hotel. Adrian's voice came from near the doorway, measured and matter-of-fact. I can be wherever I choose. Own. The word felt significant, not manage or invest in. Own. The way he seemed to own everything he touched, including the woman currently standing in a suite he'd arranged, wearing clothes he'd had moved, living a life he'd systematically reconstructed. That's not what I meant. I know what you meant. Footsteps against hardwood, drawing closer. You meant this is improper, that bosses don't visit their assistants in hotel suites, that lines are being crossed that can't be uncrossed. I turned then, found him standing in the center of the room, wearing the same charcoal suit from this morning, minus the jacket, shirt sleeves rolled to forearms that suggested he spent time doing more than signing contracts. His tie hung loose. And in the gathering darkness, he looked less like a CEO and more like what he actually was, something dangerous wearing civilization like a well-tailored disguise. What did you do to him? The question escaped before courage could fail me. What did you actually do to Evan? Something flickered across his expression, not surprise at the question, but calculation about how to answer it. He moved to the bar cart, poured 2 glasses of amber liquid I didn't ask for, handed me one with the expectation of compliance. I took it. The glass felt cool against my palm, solid in a world that had become distressingly fluid. I removed a threat, he said finally, the same clinical phrase from his office. But here, in the intimate space of the suite he'd arranged, surrounded by my belongings that his people had touched and organized, the words carried different weight. That's not an answer. My voice came steadier than I felt. I need to know. Did you... The words stuck in my throat like broken glass. Did you kill him? Adrian studied me over the rim of his glass, taking a slow sip before responding. The silence stretched between us, elastic and terrible, until it snapped under the weight of what couldn't be unsaid. He didn't answer. But silence, I'd learned, spoke louder than any confession. My knees threatened to buckle. I sank onto the cream sofa that probably cost more than a year's salary, the whiskey sloshing dangerously in my trembling hand. Oh, God, don't. His voice sharpened. Don't invoke God for a man who used you as a punching bag. Don't waste divine sympathy on someone who believed love looked like bruises. He's dead. The words felt foreign in my mouth, too big, too permanent. You killed him because I told you his name in an elevator. No. Adrian crossed the space between us, sat on the coffee table directly in front of me, forcing eye contact I wanted to avoid. I killed him because he hurt you, because he would have continued hurting you, because men like Evan Caro don't reform, they escalate, and I wasn't going to wait for the escalation that put you in a hospital or a morgue. The casual certainty in his voice, the complete absence of remorse, should have terrified me, should have sent me running to Detective Rivas with confessions that would destroy us both. Instead, I felt something worse than horror, relief. The realization hit like physical impact, stealing breath and reason in equal measure. Evan was dead, and instead of grief or guilt, I felt relieved. No more flinching at footsteps. No more calculating which words would trigger violence. No more pretending bruises were accidents while terror became the baseline of existence. What does that make me? I whispered, tears beginning to track down my face. Not for Evan, but for the person I'd become, someone who could hear about murder and feel grateful. What kind of person feels glad that someone's dead? Adrian reached out, caught a tear on his thumb with surprising gentleness. Human. It makes you human, Clara. Survival instinct isn't pretty, but it's honest. You killed someone. I needed to keep saying it, needed the words to penetrate the strange numbness that had settled over my conscience. You ended a life because he made choices that carried consequences. Adrian's hand remained on my cheek, warm and steady. Don't take responsibility for what I decided. I've made harder choices for worse reasons. Evan Caro barely registers. The callousness should have repelled me. Instead, it felt almost like absolution. This man who'd seen violence in its rawest form, offering perspective that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the villain in this story. You don't need to understand, he continued quietly, thumb tracing the line of my jaw where Evan's ring had split skin days ago. You just need to know you're safe. That's the only thing that matters. But safety, I was learning, came in different forms. Some looked like locks and security details. Others looked like a man who'd kill without hesitation and call it protection. When? I asked. When did you decide to... I still couldn't finish the sentence. His eyes held mine, unflinching. In the elevator. The moment you tried to hide your face, I saw the bruise at your temple, the split lip, the way you moved like breathing hurt. His voice dropped lower, intimate and terrible. I've seen violence my entire life, Clara. I recognize it in all its forms, and I decided right then that whoever put those marks on you would answer for it. Memory flooded back, the confined space, his hand stopping the doors, that moment when our reflections met in chrome and something fundamental shifted between us. I wasn't asking you to kill him, I whispered, though the protest felt hollow even to my own ears. No, you were asking someone to finally see what was happening to you, to acknowledge it, to make it stop. His hand left my face, but the warmth remained, ghost touch against skin. I just answered in the only language Evan Caro would have understood. More tears fell, not from horror this time, but from the strange release that came with truth. Someone had seen me, not just my bruises, but the architecture of abuse that made hiding them necessary. And instead of sympathy without action, instead of concern that evaporated when inconvenient, Adrian Morello had done something permanent, something unforgivable, something that made me safe. Don't cry for him. Adrian's voice gentled, though steel remained underneath. He earned his fate the first time he raised his hand to you. Everything after was just delayed accounting. I looked up at him through blurred vision. This man who'd built empires and destroyed threats, who wore expensive suits over a capacity for violence that should have terrified me, but somehow didn't. Not anymore. I should be horrified, I said. But you're not. No. The admission felt like falling and flying simultaneously. I'm relieved. God help me. I'm relieved he's gone. Something in Adrian's expression softened fractionally, not quite a smile, but recognition of shared truth. Then we understand each other. He stood, giving me space that felt more courtesy than distance. But as he moved toward the window, I saw the moment replay in my mind with new clarity. The elevator, the reflection, his eyes cataloging damage and making calculations that ended with someone disappearing under a bridge washed in sodium light. I hadn't just been seen in that moment. I'd been claimed. The realization should have sent me running. Instead, it settled over me like an expensive coat, warm, protective, and far too comfortable for something that should feel like a cage. Stay as long as you need tonight, Adrian said from the window, back to me, but presence still overwhelming. Marco's detail is outside. They're discreet. And tomorrow? Tomorrow, you come to work, file reports, answer phones, pretend none of this happened. He turned, and in the darkened suite, his eyes caught ambient light like a predator's. Because that's what we do, Clara. We build normal lives over dark foundations and dare the world to look too closely. He moved toward the door, and panic flared unexpectedly in my chest. Fear of being alone with what I now knew, with what I'd become complicit in through gratitude and relief. Adrian. He paused, hand on the doorknob. Thank you. The words felt inadequate, dangerous, true. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, don't thank me for being selfish. I didn't kill him for you. I killed him for me. Because what's mine stays whole, and he was breaking something I'd decided to keep. The door closed with a soft click, leaving me alone with the terrible truth. I hadn't been saved. I'd been collected. And the most damning part? Sitting in a luxury suite with my tears drying and my heart finally steady, I couldn't bring myself to mind. Outside, Manhattan glittered with false promise. Inside, I poured another whiskey and tried to remember who I'd been before an elevator ride changed everything. The woman in the window's reflection looked back at me, no longer crying, no longer afraid, just claimed. The lilies arrived at 9:23 a.m. on Thursday, delivered to the suite by a concierge whose professional smile didn't quite mask his unease. White blooms, dozens of them, arranged with the kind of precision that spoke of expense and intention. Their fragrance filled the room immediately, cloying, funeral sweet, wrong in a way I couldn't articulate. I stood in the doorway holding my coffee, watching the concierge place them on the dining table with careful reverence, and felt ice crystallize in my veins before I understood why. "There was no card, Miss Vance," he said, already backing toward the door, as if proximity to the flowers carried contamination. Just this note. The small envelope lay among the lilies like a serpent in Eden. Heavy cardstock, expensive. My hands trembled as I opened it, and the message inside was written in bold black ink that bled slightly at the edges. "She cries beautifully." The coffee mug slipped from nerveless fingers, shattering against marble in an explosion of ceramic and dark liquid that looked too much like blood. The concierge jumped, started to offer help, but something in my expression sent him retreating faster. "I'll send housekeeping." "No!" My voice came from somewhere distant, mechanical. "Leave. Now." The door closed. I stood alone with flowers that smelled like death and words that tasted like threat, my reflection fracturing in the spreading puddle of coffee at my feet. "She cries beautifully." Someone had watched me, seen me break, knew about tears that should have been private, protected, mine. The violation felt physical. Hands I couldn't see touching moments I'd thought belonged only to me and Adrian. My phone was in my hand before conscious thought, Adrian's number dialing with shaking fingers. He answered on the first ring. "Clara. There are flowers." The words tumbled out, irrational and urgent. "White lilies. A note. It says..." My voice cracked. "It says she cries beautifully." Silence on the line, but not empty, charged, dangerous. "Don't touch them. Don't touch anything. I'm sending Marco now." His voice had gone cold, clinical, the tone I'd heard once before, in an elevator, when he'd catalogued bruises and made decisions that ended with bodies under bridges. "Stay away from the windows. Lock the door. Do not open it for anyone except Marco." "Adrian, what—" But he'd already disconnected. Marco arrived 11 minutes later with two men I didn't recognize, broad-shouldered, efficient, the kind of people who made violence look like choreography. They moved through the suite with practiced precision, photographing the flowers from multiple angles, bagging the note in evidence plastic, sweeping for devices I didn't want to think about. I sat on the cream sofa where Adrian had sat 3 nights ago, wiping tears and making promises, and watched my sanctuary become a crime scene. "Victor Corin," Marco said finally, settling into the chair across from me with the weariness of someone who'd seen this script play out too many times. "Russian distribution, primarily pharmaceuticals. Evan Caro worked his lower-tier operations." The name meant nothing to me. Just another player in the complex machinery of Adrian's empire. Legitimate business bleeding into less legitimate ventures. The kind of gray areas that built fortunes and required men like Marco to maintain order. "Why is he sending me flowers?" "Because he knows." Marco's expression remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes, respect maybe, or recognition of worthy opposition. "Knows Adrian was involved in Caro's disappearance, knows you matter to the boss, so he's sending a message. She cries beautifully. A message that said, I'm watching. I see what he protects. And protection only works until it doesn't. What does he want? Answers. Respect. Probably blood. Marco stood, gestured to his men who began removing the lilies with the careful attention usually reserved for bomb disposal. Corin's old school. Believes in proportional response. You cost him an asset, even a small one like Caro. Now he wants to even the scales. My hands clenched in my lap, knuckles white. So people are dying because of me. People are dying because they chose a violent life and found someone more violent. He moved toward the door, paused. The boss will handle this. You just stay inside until he does. Stay inside. Another cage, this one lined with fear instead of silk. Adrian arrived at 2:17 p.m., dismissing Marco with a single look before the door even fully closed. He wore navy today, the color of deep water, of things that drowned quietly, and his expression carried that particular quality of restrained fury I'd learned meant someone was about to pay for their mistakes. He went directly to where the lilies had been, studied the empty space as if reading invisible threats written in absent petals. "Victor Corin," he said without preamble. "He runs distribution networks from Brighton Beach to the Bronx. Pharmaceuticals, mostly, with side ventures in whatever turns profit. Evan was one of his street-level distributors." Marco explained. I stood from the sofa, needing movement to contain the panic clawing at my ribs. "Adrian, if people are dying because They were dead long before you ever met them." He turned, and his eyes carried absolute certainty. "Corin's been testing boundaries for months, looking for weakness in my territory, leverage to renegotiate terms. You didn't create this conflict, Clara. You're just the excuse he's using to start it." The logic should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like absolution I didn't deserve. "He watched me cry," I whispered. "Somehow he knew about the elevator, about that night." "No." Adrian moved closer, and despite everything, his presence still brought that strange cocktail of fear and safety. "He's fishing, making educated guesses based on timing and rumor. The note is designed to unsettle you, make you feel exposed. It's psychological warfare, and you're letting it work." "Then it's working." My voice rose despite efforts at control. "Because I feel exposed. Because white lilies smell like funerals, and someone out there thinks threatening me will get to you, which means—" Realization crashed over me like cold water. "Which means they're right. I am leverage. Yes." No denial, no soft lies to cushion the truth. The moment I decided you mattered, you became a vulnerability. That's the cost of protection in my world. Visibility breeds targeting. I sank back onto the sofa, suddenly exhausted by the weight of being valuable to someone dangerous. "What happens now?" "Now, I double your security. Marco's team will rotate shifts, 3 men minimum. You don't leave this suite without cleared escort. No visitors except me, no deliveries without verification." He cataloged each restriction with clinical precision, building a new cage around the old one. "And Corin?" His smile was brief, terrible. I remind him that some boundaries exist for reasons beyond tradition. The implication hung heavy. Another body, another disappearance, another life ended because I'd cried in an elevator and caught the attention of a man who answered tears with violence. "I don't want more people dead because of me," I said quietly. "Then you're in the wrong story." Adrian poured himself whiskey from the bar cart, offered me one I declined. "This isn't a fairy tale, Clara. It's not even a tragedy. It's just business, conducted by people who understand that mercy looks like weakness, and weakness gets you killed. That's a horrible way to live." "Yes." He drank, expression unreadable. "But it keeps you breathing." That night, alone in the suite with 3 men stationed outside like sentries guarding a vault, I dreamed of the elevator again. Chrome walls, fluorescent lights, my reflection multiplying into infinity. But this time, when the doors began to close, Adrian didn't stop them with his hand. Instead, he stepped inside the descending darkness with me, and we fell together, past the lobby, past the basement, into depths where light couldn't follow, and choices couldn't be unmade. In the dream, he held my hand. In the dream, falling felt like flying. I woke at 3:47 a.m. with my heart racing and the scent of lilies still clinging to the air, despite their removal hours ago. Some contamination couldn't be scrubbed away with bleach and efficiency. My phone glowed with a new message. "Adrian, sleep. You're safe." But safety, I'd learned, was just another word for the eye of a storm. That brief, false peace before violence resumed its natural rhythm. I typed back, "Are you?" His response came immediately. I'm never safe, but I'm always dangerous. There's a difference. I set the phone aside, pulled expensive sheets over my head, and tried to remember what normal felt like before a man decided I was worth killing for. Outside, 3 guards stood watch. Somewhere in Brighton Beach, Victor Corin made plans, and in whatever darkness Adrian Morello inhabited between legitimate business and underground authority, another decision was being made about proportional response and the cost of threatening what belonged to him. I fell back into uneasy sleep, dreaming of elevators that descended forever and men who caught you before you hit bottom, then made you grateful they'd been there to push. The call came at 4:47 a.m., shattering the fragile sleep I'd managed despite Lily's and threats and dreams of descending elevators. Marco's phone, not Adrian's. That alone made my blood run cold. I answered on the second ring, sitting up in sheets that suddenly felt too expensive, too soft for the kind of news that arrived before dawn. Clara. Marco's voice carried something I'd never heard from him before, something close to fear. Is the boss with you? No. Why? What's happened? Silence stretched like wire pulled taut. Then, they took Luca. Luca Santoro, Adrian's driver, the man who'd been assigned to my security detail twice this week, who smiled at me with grandfatherly warmth despite the gun I knew he carried. 40 years with the Morello family, Marco had mentioned once, loyal unto death. Who took him? But I already knew. Corin's people, professional extraction from his apartment in Queens at 3:15 a.m. Marco's voice went flat, repertorial, the only way to deliver unbearable news. They left a message, written in his blood on the bedroom wall. Trade her for him. The suite tilted. I gripped the phone harder, knuckles white against expensive technology. Where's Adrian? On his way to you. Don't open the door for anyone else. The line went dead. I sat in darkness that suddenly felt less like protection and more like a trap, luxury walls closing in while men bled because I'd become leverage. Because Adrian had decided I mattered, and mattering in his world carried a price counted in bodies. Adrian arrived at 5:03 a.m. with Marco and 4 other men who looked like violence wrapped in tactical gear. He wore black, not his usual tailored suits, but something harder, more functional. Combat pants, fitted shirt, and an expression so cold it made the morning chill feel tropical by comparison. He didn't speak immediately, just studied me with those dark eyes that had once catalogued bruises and now calculated angles of attack, defensive positions, acceptable casualties. Luca, I started, voice breaking on the name, is alive for now. Adrian's tone carried the clinical precision of a surgeon discussing an operation, emotionless, focused, already 10 steps ahead. Corin wants a trade. You for him. Exchange at midnight tonight. Location to be disclosed 1 hour prior. Then we make the trade. The words escaped before wisdom could stop them. 5 sets of eyes turned toward me, Adrian's burning with something between fury and disbelief. Absolutely not. His voice dropped to that dangerous register that preceded violence. You're not leaving this suite. Marco, double the detail. No one in or out without my explicit approval. A man is going to die because of me. Men die in this business regardless. He moved to the window, hands in pockets, every line of his body radiating controlled rage. Luca knew the risks when he took Morello money. What he didn't sign up for was me trading a life I've decided to protect for one already sworn to my service. The cold calculation of it, the way he'd already decided Luca was acceptable loss, stole my breath. You can't just... I can. He turned, and I saw it fully then. The man beneath the corporate veneer. Not Adrian Morello, CEO. Not the composed executive who negotiated billion-dollar deals over expensive lunches. But something older, more primal. The thing whispered about in break rooms and police reports that mysteriously disappeared. This is what protection looks like, Clara. It's not soft. It's not fair. It's me deciding you're worth more than good men and living with that choice. I won't hide behind bulletproof glass while people bleed. I stood, wrapped arms around myself against a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. I won't live in a cage, Adrian, not even one you've lined with silk and called salvation. Something flickered in his expression. Respect, maybe, or recognition of the woman I'd become since he'd first found me crying in an elevator. Not the broken thing that had spoken Evan's name in desperation, but someone who'd seen darkness and learned to speak its language. "Then you're a fool," he said quietly. "But you're my fool. And I don't negotiate with men who think threatening you will get them what they want." He moved toward the door, gesturing to Marco. "Full lockdown, 3-man rotation, weapons visible. If Corin's people come within a block of this building, I want to know before they've taken their second step." "Adrian." His name tasted like plea and protest combined. "What are you going to do?" He paused at the threshold, and when he looked back, I saw the truth of what everyone had tried to warn me about. Adrian Morello wasn't a hero. He wasn't even a villain in the theatrical sense. No monologues, no grand gestures of evil. He was simply a man who'd built an empire on understanding that some problems required permanent solutions, and mercy was a luxury afforded only to the protected. What I should have done the moment Corin sent those flowers. His voice carried absolute certainty. "I'm going to remind this city that some boundaries exist for reasons beyond tradition." He left then, Marco and the others falling into formation around him like planets orbiting a dark star. Through the closing door, I caught glimpses of tactical preparation. Weapons being checked, communications established, the machinery of violence moving with practiced efficiency. I stood alone in the suite that had become my prison, watching the first light of dawn bleed across Manhattan. Somewhere in this city, Luca Santoro was being held by men who believed life could be traded like currency. And somewhere else, Adrian Morello was preparing to teach them that some debts could only be paid in blood. My phone buzzed. A final message from Adrian: "Stay inside, stay safe. And Clara, don't open that door for anyone, no matter what you hear." Thunder rolled across the city, distant but approaching, the kind that promised storms and floods and the washing away of evidence. I deleted the message, moved to the window, and watched lightning fork across a darkening sky. Below, 3 guards stood sentinel. Above, clouds gathered with ominous intent, and somewhere between protection and possession, I realized I'd stopped trying to distinguish between the two. Adrian had promised no one would hurt me again. I just hoped that promise didn't require counting bodies to believe it. The docks smelled like oil and salt water, and the particular rot that accumulated where the city met the river, a liminal space where legitimate commerce bled into darker transactions, where containers held more than manifests declared, where men like Victor Corin conducted business that required distance from surveillance and witnesses. Adrian arrived at 11:47 p.m. with Marco and 8 others who moved like shadows given form. No sirens, no flashing lights, just the quiet efficiency of violence prepared to answer violence. The kind of reckoning that happened in darkness and was forgotten by dawn. Luca was being held in Warehouse 37B, according to intelligence Marco had extracted from one of Corin's lower-tier distributors through methods Adrian didn't ask about and didn't need to know. The building squatted at the edge of the water like a malignant growth. Rusted metal, broken windows, the perfect theater for the kind of performance Corin wanted to stage. Trade her for him. As if Clara were currency, as if the woman who'd cried in his elevator, who'd spoken a name that signed a death warrant, who'd become something he couldn't quite name but refused to surrender, as if she could be negotiated like tonnage or territory. Victor Corin had made a fundamental miscalculation. He'd assumed Adrian's protection was strategic, a business decision made with the same cold logic that governed pharmaceutical distributions and offshore accounts. He hadn't understood that some things transcended strategy. The first guard fell at 11:53 p.m. Silenced shot, precise placement, body caught before it could make noise against concrete. Marco's work, efficient and practiced. They moved through the perimeter like smoke, neutralizing positions with the choreography of men who'd done this dance too many times to count. No rage, no theatrics, just purpose refined to its purest form. Adrian had learned long ago that anger made men sloppy. Fury caused mistakes, the kind that left witnesses, evidence, complications that haunted you later. But cold calculation? That built empires and buried threats so deep they became geological layers, forgotten under the weight of time and deliberate erasure. The warehouse interior was cathedral dark, interrupted by bare bulbs hanging from chains. Shadows pooled in corners where rust met concrete, and the air tasted like metal and fear. Luca hung suspended in the center, ropes around his wrists, blood tracking down his face from a gash above his eye, but alive. Conscious, meeting Adrian's gaze across the space with the kind of understanding that passed between men who'd sworn oaths and kept them. Victor Corin stood 20 feet away, flanked by 6 men carrying weapons with the casual comfort of long-time familiarity. He was older than expected, 60s maybe, with silver hair and the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd survived too many conflicts to fear one more. His suit was expensive, but worn, and his eyes held the particular darkness of men who'd made peace with damnation decades ago. Adrian Morello. His voice carried a thick Russian accent, softened by years in Brooklyn. Punctual. I appreciate punctuality in business. This isn't business, Victor. Adrian's voice remained level, empty of everything except absolute certainty. This is a lesson in boundaries. Corin laughed, a sound like gravel grinding against stone. Boundaries? You kill one of my distributors and you lecture me about boundaries? He gestured to Luca. I'm simply collecting what's owed. An eye for an eye. Old Testament mathematics. Evan Caro was owed what he received. Adrian moved forward, and his men flanked him with practiced precision. Weapons raised, angles covered, exits blocked. He put hands on something that wasn't his to touch. Ah, yes, the girl. Corin's smile was knowing, ugly. All this for a woman who cried in an elevator? You've gone soft, Adrian, sentimental. That's dangerous in our world. The air changed, subtle but unmistakable, like the pressure drop before storms. Marco shifted slightly, recognizing the warning signs. Luca's eyes narrowed despite his injuries, reading the language of violence about to be spoken. Adrian's expression didn't change, but when he spoke, his voice carried something that made even seasoned men take involuntary steps backward. You don't understand what that meant. 4 words, quiet as prayer, final as execution. What meant? Corin's confidence wavered fractionally. That she cried? Women cry. It's what they do when... That I saw it. Adrian's hand moved to the holster under his jacket. Not fast, not theatrical, just inevitable. That for 8 months she came to work with bruises hidden under makeup. That she made herself invisible because a man convinced her love looked like violence. That when she finally broke, when tears came because even the strongest things shatter eventually, I was there to witness it. His gun cleared leather with practiced ease. And I decided that kind of breaking, that specific moment of vulnerability, mattered more than territory or respect, or whatever petty grievance you've convinced yourself justifies this. The first shot shattered Corin's right kneecap before his men could process movement into response. He went down screaming, and chaos erupted in the warehouse, gunfire splitting the night, muzzle flashes illuminating violence in strobe light fragments. Adrian moved through it like choreography learned in blood. Marco's team had trained for this, coordinated fire, overlapping coverage, the kind of precision that came from understanding that mistakes meant body bags. Corin's men fell with the inevitability of dominoes, not because they were unskilled, but because they'd brought regular violence to a fight against something colder, more refined. It lasted 47 seconds. Then silence, broken only by Corin's ragged breathing and the distant sound of water against concrete. Adrian stood over him, gun pointed at the center mass with absolute steadiness. "You sent flowers to her suite, watched her, threatened her because you thought it would make me negotiate." He crouched down, and his voice dropped to something almost conversational. "You fundamentally misunderstood what she is to me." "What?" Corin coughed blood. "What is she then?" Adrian's smile was brief, terrible. "Mine." The final shot was mercy disguised as ending. He returned to the Meridian at 3:42 a.m., dismissed Marco and the security detail with a gesture, and took the elevator alone, the same elevator where this had started, where tears and truth had collided into something irreversible. Blood marked his cuff. Gunpowder residue dusted his hands. The scent of smoke clung to his hair like expensive cologne turned toxic. But his eyes, those dark eyes that had catalogued bruises and calculated death with equal precision, held the particular emptiness that came after violence, when adrenaline faded and left only the weight of what had been done. Clara opened the door before he could use his key. She stood in the threshold wearing yesterday's clothes, eyes red from sleeplessness, hair disheveled in ways that made her look younger, more vulnerable than the composed assistant who filed reports and answered phones. She'd been waiting all night, judging by the cold coffee on the counter and the way her hands trembled when she reached for him. He didn't speak. Couldn't. Maybe. Words felt inadequate after what he'd done, what he'd become in service of keeping her safe. Just stood there, letting her see the blood, the evidence, the proof that protection in his world required crossing lines most people didn't know existed. Her hand lifted, hesitant at first, then steady, and touched his jaw, gentle, exploring, as if memorizing the angles of his face. Then her fingers moved to her own cheek, tracing the space where Evan's ring had split skin weeks ago, where bruises had bloomed and faded into memory. The gesture said everything, before and after, violence received and violence answered, the symmetry of it. "You're safe now," he murmured, voice rough from smoke and silence. She met his eyes, and in hers he saw recognition of what tonight had cost. Not just bodies in a warehouse, not just Corin's empire dismantled piece by bloody piece, but something more fundamental, the final dissolution of any pretense that this was normal, that protection could exist without possession, that she could remain unchanged by proximity to darkness. "No," she whispered, and her smile was sad and true and terrible. "We both are." She pulled him inside, closed the door on the city and its judgment, on the guards stationed below, and the blood that even now was being washed from warehouse floors by men whose job was making evidence disappear. Outside, thunder rolled one final time, the storm finally breaking, rain washing the city clean of sins it would forget by morning. Inside, Clara Vance and Adrian Morello stood together in the wreckage of their transformation, understanding finally that safety and captivity, protection and possession, salvation and damnation, in his world, they'd always been the same thing. 4 weeks after Victor Corin's blood washed into the East River, after Detective Rivas closed his investigation with the weary acceptance of a man who knew when walls were too high to scale, after the city swallowed another disappearance and moved on with its indifferent hunger, I stood in the elevator at 8:47 p.m., watching my reflection multiply into infinity. The same chrome walls, the same fluorescent lights, casting everything in sterile clarity. The same mirrored surfaces that had witnessed my breaking, my confession, the moment when tears became catalyst for violence that reshaped my entire existence. But the woman looking back at me was different. No mascara tracked down hollow cheeks. No trembling hands pressed against ribs that remembered boots and fists. No desperate prayer for doors to close before anyone saw what I'd become. Just Clara Vance, composed, steady, wearing a charcoal dress that cost more than my old apartment's monthly rent, and carrying the particular stillness that came from understanding exactly what protection cost and choosing to pay it anyway. The elevator dinged softly. I didn't flinch. Adrian stepped inside. He'd stayed late reviewing the Rotterdam contracts, the shipment that had been missing when Marco first mentioned Evan's name, now recovered and redistributed through channels that bypassed Corin's former territory, empire maintenance, the endless machinery of legitimate business built on foundations most people chose not to examine too closely. He wore navy tonight, tie loosened, and carried the scent of his cologne mixed with the particular exhaustion that came from building kingdoms one careful decision at a time. His eyes found mine in the reflection, not cataloging damage anymore, but reading something more complex. Recognition, maybe, or shared understanding of what we'd become to each other. Neither of us pressed a button. The doors remained open, the elevator suspended between departure and arrival, holding us in that liminal space where truth lived. His hand lifted, casual, almost unconscious, and hovered near mine against the chrome railing. Not touching, but close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. Close enough that the space between us felt like a question being asked without words. Our eyes met in the mirrored wall. Two reflections trapped in infinite regression, the CEO and his assistant, the protector and the protected, the man who'd killed for me and the woman who'd let him. "Do you regret it?" I asked quietly. The question hung in the air like smoke. Not do you regret killing Evan? Or do you regret Victor Corin bleeding out in that warehouse? Just it. The encompassing totality of what had happened since that first night when tears and truth collided into something irreversible. He studied me through the reflection, not avoiding direct eye contact, but choosing this mediated version. Safer, somehow. Less raw than looking at each other straight on and admitting what we both knew. "Every day," he said finally, voice carrying the weight of absolute honesty. "I regret that it was necessary. That the world is built in such a way that protection requires violence, that you'll carry the knowledge of what I did forever, and that knowledge changes people in ways they can't predict or control." The elevator's fluorescent light flickered, brief, almost imperceptible, and for a moment our reflections shifted into shadow. Two silhouettes in chrome and darkness, ghosts of who we'd been before an elevator ride changed everything. Before I was the woman who'd traded one cage for another and called it freedom. Before he was the man who'd decided I mattered enough to build walls of violence around. "But would you do it again?" I pressed, needing to hear him say it, needing confirmation that this, us, whatever we'd become, wasn't just the aftermath of trauma bonding and Stockholm Syndrome wrapped in expensive suits and luxury suites. His jaw tightened fractionally. Then, yes. One word. Simple, final, true. "Without hesitation," he continued, and now he did turn to face me directly. No more hiding behind reflections and mediated truth. "I'd do it again. Every choice, every consequence, every line crossed and boundary shattered. Because the alternative was watching you break completely. And that..." Something flickered in his dark eyes. "That was unacceptable." The light stabilized. Our reflections returned to normal, solid, present, real. I looked at him, truly looked, the way you examined architecture to understand how foundations supported impossible weight. Adrian Morello had built an empire on understanding leverage and power, on knowing when mercy was strength and when it was fatal weakness. He'd made decisions that left bodies in rivers and questions unanswered in police files. He'd destroyed monsters for me, and in doing so had revealed the monster in himself. The terrible truth was, I didn't mind anymore. Maybe I should have. Maybe the Clara from 6 months ago, the one who believed fairness existed, who thought working hard and staying quiet would be enough, who'd convinced herself love could be gentle, maybe that version would have been horrified. But that Clara had died in an elevator, drowned in tears and truth. This Clara understood that protection came in different forms. Some looked like locks and security details. Others looked like a man who'd kill without hesitation and call it love. The doors began to close, automatic timers finally overriding the suspension. I pressed the lobby button, watching numbers descend with the same steady progression that had carried us through this entire journey, 23 to ground level. The architecture of descent that had become our strange metaphor. When the elevator reached the lobby with its soft ding, the doors slid open to reveal marble floors and the night security guard offering a polite nod. The real world waited beyond, autumn air turning sharp with winter's promise, traffic sounds, the ordinary machinery of a city that had forgotten Victor Corin and Evan Caro, and all the violence that had transpired in service of keeping one woman safe. I stepped out first, feeling the solid ground beneath expensive heels, then paused, looked back. Adrian stood in the elevator threshold, backlit by fluorescent light, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite parse. Not possessive, exactly, not controlling, just present, aware, like he understood this was a choice I was making, not a cage he'd built. I offered a faint smile, not happiness exactly, but something close to acceptance, to understanding that we'd both been changed by what happened here, and there was no going back to who we'd been before. "Come on, Adrian," I said quietly, extending my hand. "Let's go live in the daylight." For a moment, he didn't move, just studied my outstretched hand like it was a contract being offered, terms and conditions that required careful consideration before signing. Then he stepped forward, took my hand in his, warm, steady, solid, and followed me into the lobby. The elevator doors closed behind us with a soft whisper of finality. Neither of us was crying. We crossed the marble floor together, no longer boss and assistant, not quite lovers, but something more complex that didn't have easy language. Two people who'd found each other in darkness and decided that surviving together was better than drowning alone. Outside, the city stretched before us, lights and noise, and millions of lives being lived without knowledge of what protection cost or how salvation could taste like blood. Marco waited by the car, professional as always, pretending not to notice our joined hands. I looked up at the Morello International Building, that gleaming monument to power and ambition where this had all started. Where an elevator had become confessional, catalyst, and contract all at once. Adrian followed my gaze, and I felt his hand tighten fractionally around mine. "Regrets?" he asked, turning the question back on me. I thought about Evan's bruises fading from my skin, about Luca, recovered now and back to his grandfatherly smiles despite whatever he'd endured in that warehouse. About Detective Rivas, filing reports that would gather dust in forgotten archives. About Victor Corin's empire, dismantled and redistributed until even memory couldn't reconstruct what had been. I thought about the cost of safety, the price of protection. The way darkness could look like deliverance if you were desperate enough, broken enough, tired enough of carrying fear alone. "Every day," I said honestly, echoing his words. "But I'd choose this again." His smile was brief, genuine. "Then we understand each other." We got in the car. Marco drove us through Manhattan streets turned liquid with neon and rain. And for the first time since tears fell in chrome-walled confessional, I felt something close to peace. Not innocence, that was gone, burned away in warehouse gunfire and bridge-side reckonings, but peace. Hard-earned, blood-bought, and entirely ours. The kind you could only find after descending through darkness and discovering someone had been falling with you all along. 6 months later, I found a single white lily on my desk. My heart stopped. Then I saw the note, written in Adrian's precise handwriting. Some flowers are apologies, some are threats. These are neither. They're reminders that beautiful things can survive in darkness. I looked up to find him watching from his office doorway, that almost smile playing at his lips, the one reserved only for me, for moments when the masks came off and we acknowledged what we'd become. Not a fairy tale, not a tragedy. Just two people who'd learned that sometimes salvation wears expensive suits and carries the scent of gunpowder, that protection and possession are separated by the thinnest of lines, that love, real love, doesn't always arrive on white horses. Sometimes it comes in elevators at 8:47 p.m., sees your braking, and decides you're worth keeping whole. I placed the lily in water, returned to my expense reports, and smiled. We'd both learned to live in the daylight. We'd just never forgotten what we were capable of in the dark. If you enjoyed this dark descent into obsession and protection, Hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that explore the beautiful, terrible spaces where love and violence intertwine. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't the monster in the shadows, it's the one who kills monsters for you. Stay tuned for more tales of desire, danger, and the price we pay for salvation. Your next obsession is just one story away.